Many shocking claims are made about economic inequality in the U.S. News stories regularly appear with surprising headlines about the extent of this inequality. But are these headlines accurate? To get to the truth of these claims, we are going to take a close look at the facts and data around income and wealth inequality in the United States. The goal will be to get an understanding of the size and scope of economic inequality, and then to look at some important related facts. To start, we have to ask, how can we know how much money people have? There are a few key sources that provide this sort of information. First is the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau conducts a variety of surveys that gather information about different aspects of American society. One of these is the Current Population Survey, which involves about 60,000 households per year and is a source for data on income. The Survey of Income and Program Participation provides data on income as well as wealth. Another source is the Survey of Consumer Finances, or SCF, which is conducted every 3 years with about 6,500 households. It is run by the Federal Reserve Board and provides highly detailed information on income, assets, debt, and other aspects of household finances. A third source is the IRS, which provides data on income from tax returns filed with the government. Along with these main sources, there are additional sources that provide analysis and explanation of the data. These include the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, various think tanks, and articles and papers published by economists. For all of the sources that we use, there is a link in the description. You can use this to look at the data for yourself and explore it in greater depth. We will start by looking at income. This table shows the distribution of income according to the IRS data for 2019. It is divided according to selected percentiles of income. It starts with the top 1% and then the next 9%. Together, these make up the top 10%. The next 40% is those who are from 50 to 90% of the distribution, and last is the bottom 50%. Here is what the data from the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances looks like. And here is what it looks like based on work done by economists Piketty, Says, and Zuckman, again for 2019. All of these are estimates. None of them are perfect or exact, but they do give us a good sense of what the distribution looks like, especially when different sources show similar results. We will focus on the data from Piketty, Says, and Zuckman, or PSC, because their approach incorporates a number of different data sources. It is based on tax data from the IRS, but also takes into account other sources, such as survey data, including the SCF. There are a few observations we can make from this data. First, the top 10% make more than the entire middle class. That is, those who are in the next 40 group. Also, the top 10% make about half of all income. Or in other words, they make about as much as the entire bottom 90%. To be in the top 10%, a person has to make somewhere around $150,000 a year or more. The bottom 50% of people make about 14% of total income. This is less than the amount of income made by the top 1%. One important detail to notice is that the distribution is heavily skewed at every level. When looking from 0 to 100%, it is clearly shifted towards the top 10%. However, it is also heavily skewed within the top 10%. Close to half of all of the income made by the top 10% goes to the top 1%. And within the top 1%, almost half of the income goes to the top 0.1%. The top 0.1% make about 8.5% of total income. While income is thoroughly concentrated at the highest levels of the distribution, the situation with wealth is even more extreme. Wealth, or net worth, is the value of everything that a person owns. It is all of their assets minus their debts. Sources on wealth are more limited. Here we will look again at data from the SCF as well as data from PSC. Again, you can find these sources in the description if you want to take a look. Starting with the SCF, here is what the distribution looks like. And here is what it looks like according to PSC. Again, we will focus on the numbers from PSC, but the values are similar. The top 10% have over 70% of all wealth in the US. About half of this, 35%, is owned by the top 1%. The top 1% have more wealth than the bottom 90%, 35% compared to about 28%. The bottom 50% have about 0.2% of total wealth. Other estimates suggest that the wealth of the bottom 50% is closer to around 1 or 2%. Either way, it is a very small fraction distributed among 50% of the population. Many people in the bottom 50%, in fact, have a negative net worth. They have less than zero wealth. The middle class, 40% of the population, share about 28% of total wealth. The top 0.1% have about 18% of total wealth, and the top 0.01% have about 9%. The top 0.01% is made up of about 25,000 adults who have an average wealth of around $330 million each. Inequality is a normal characteristic of modern human societies. Basically, all countries today have significant inequality. What is striking, however, is the extreme scale of this inequality in the United States, and also, as we will look at next, how this inequality has changed in recent decades. We have a sense of how income and wealth are currently distributed, but another important thing to consider is how this distribution has changed over time. Starting with income, this chart shows changes in income shares from SCF data from 1989 to 2019. Income shares for the highest 1% had a strong upward trend over this 30-year period, starting at 17% and reaching 19% in 2019. Taking the average of the first 3 surveys and the last 3, the increase was around 6%. The next 9% have had a slight increase in their share. The bottom 50% have mostly stagnated or declined. Interestingly, the next 40 group, the middle class, saw a substantial decline in their income share. Again, taking the average of the first and last 3 surveys, their income share declined by around 6%. The SCF only began in the 1980s. To get a picture of a broader time span, we have to look at other sources. First, we have a report by the Congressional Budget Office on the distribution of household income from 1979 to 2019. This report is based on IRS data combined with data from the Census Bureau's current population survey. It shows a similar trend where the majority of income growth is concentrated at the highest income levels. The share going to the top 1% has increased by around 7%, while it has dropped by about the same amount for the middle 3 groups. In this chart, the lower 2 shades of green represent the bottom 80% of people. Their share of income fell by about 8%. There are similar results in a report by the Congressional Research Service, which is based on census data going back to 1967. This chart, from the same report, based on data from the World Inequality Database, shows how within the top 1%, growth is mostly concentrated within the top 0.01%. And here is similar data from the CBO report. Finally, looking at the data from PSC, here is how things have changed. The bottom 50% income share has declined from around 20% in 1979 to around 14% in 2019. The middle 40% has gone from 45 to 41%, while the top 10% has gone from 34 to 46%. The top 1% increased from about 11 to 19%. The top 0.01% nearly tripled from 1.3 to 3.8%. A study by the Rand Corporation looked at income growth between 1975 and 2018. They calculated that if income growth for these groups had not diverged, and instead, if income inequality stayed at about the same level it was in 1975, then the bottom 90% would make around $2.5 trillion more each year. This would be 67% above what they actually make. The average worker would make around $20,000 more each year. The next two charts show how the income of people at different levels of the distribution would be different if inequality hadn't increased since 1975. Most people would make more money. Even those at the 95th percentile would make more. Only those at the very top would make less. Another study by the Economic Policy Institute found a similar result. For wealth, the same trend is apparent. Looking at the SCF data for 1989 to 2019, wealth for the top 1% increased significantly, going from 26% to 33%. The wealth of the next 9% increased slightly from 36 to 38%, while the wealth of the bottom 50% declined from around 4% to around 2%. The middle class's share of wealth declined from 34 to 27%. This chart from a CBO report on family wealth based on the SCF shows these trends in a different way. This chart from the same report shows how shares of wealth have changed. And finally, a comparison of wealth and income. Another report from the Congressional Research Service analyzed the mean to median ratio. When the ratio is high, it means that the average value is greater than the middle value, suggesting that wealth is concentrated towards the top. As you can see, the ratio starts at 4 in 1989 and increases to 6.6 for 2013, indicating a strong shift in the wealth distribution towards the highest wealth levels. Data from PSC also shows this trend. The bottom 50% wealth share has declined from around 1% in 1979 to around 0.2% in 2019. The middle 40% has gone from about 34 to 28%. The next 9 from 42 to 37%, and the top 1% from 23 to 35%. The share for the top 0.01% more than tripled from 2.7 to 9.1%. In total, the top 10% share increased from 65 to 71%. Overall, the concentration of wealth has followed a U-shape. At the beginning of the century, the top 10% had a very high percentage of total wealth. This reached a peak at the start of the Great Depression, but then began to decline, and consequently, the wealth share of the bottom 90% began to increase. The bottom 90%'s wealth share increased rapidly during the 1930s and 1940s. It increased again from the 1960s to the mid-1980s, where it reached a peak but then began to decline. The same U-shape is present in income shares. The late 1970s and 1980s was a turning point. Up until then, the bottom 90% had mostly seen growth in wealth and income shares, but this began to reverse. The economy continued to grow as it had before, GDP per capita continued to rise and set new records. But now, most of the added wealth and income of economic growth was going only to the top. The income and wealth of the bottom 90% was stagnant. Most of this change is due to increases at the very top. From 1979 to 2019, the top 0.1%'s wealth share increased about 10%, from 7.7 to 17.6%. At the same time, the top 10%'s share only increased 6%, from 65.4 to 71.4%. The wealth share of the top 10%, excluding the top 1%, in fact declined by about 6%. Now that we have an overall picture of the income and wealth distribution in the U.S., there are a few related facts and additional details that are worth looking at.